Hello, I'm John Taylor, and I'm here to talk about Latin and, to a lesser extent, Greek language at GCSE. The language paper, of course, is compulsory. It's 90 minutes long. It's for 100 marks. It represents 50% of GCSE, and all the marks are for assessment objective number 1, which is knowledge and understanding of the language. The defined vocabulary, for which Ofqual set a minimum of 400, is actually 450 in Latin, 409 in Greek. I was chief examiner in Greek at the time all this was done. I found out that Latin had got 450. I initially felt slightly miffed, could have asked for a few more, but actually I suppose Greek is a bit more harder and it started a bit later typically, so maybe it's fine as it is. The restricted vocabulary, that's for the English into Latin or Greek sentences. For that, Ofqual set a minimum of 100. In Latin, again, it's slightly more than in Greek, it's 125. Actually, in Greek, it is only 96, and you've got me to thank for that, because I simply had it in 4 columns and miscounted. I thought there were 100 and there were only 96. They waved it through. I have a feeling that Ofqual must have had a kind of long, hard day dealing with a chemistry specification or something, and they just waved through quite a few things on the classics, slightly to my surprise. The next one is that the restricted grammar list for the English sentences in Greek only applies also to the grammar questions, which are the alternative to those sentences. I thought it was unreasonable to have it on the whole specification. But I was surprised that they waved it through, the imbalance with Latin. Having said that, the Latin ones, although they're nominally on the whole specification, and that certainly includes things like subjunctive constructions, I think that in practice, there are some things they wouldn't ask. I think I'd be surprised to see a question on the gerundive, for example. Another thing that Ofqual laid down is that the passages to be dealt with, passages of unseen language for comprehension or translation, must amount to a minimum of 300 words. So we're just looking at that in a little bit more detail. So section A, the first passage 1, for comprehension, about 100 words. A story from mythology or from Roman or Greek, respectively, domestic life, with short comprehensions, including derivations. In practice, it's nearly always mythology. One year in Greek, one of my predecessors devised an ingenious passage of everyday life about a family, the family of a vase painter who specialized in scenes of mythology. So he had a kind of inset story, but usually it is just a straightforward story from myth. The derivations amount to 4 marks, so that's 4 of the 20 short comprehension questions for 16. Then there are grammar questions on a section of the same passage, usually about half of it or slightly less, or the alternative of English to Latin or English to Greek sentences, which we'll come back to all that in a minute. For 10 marks, so section A totals 30. Then section B, comprehension, again, passage 2, about 100 words, a story from, the spec just says history, though it's always going to be ancient history. It can certainly be a Greek story on the Latin paper, but I think I'd be surprised to see anything outside the ancient world. Again, we start off with short comprehension questions to kind of get candidates going, and then probably for most of the toughest part of the thing, which is the unseen section, unseen translation, passage 3. That's a continuation of the same story, and again, Ofqual have to say at least 90 words from unseen translation. So obviously, if it were only 90, then the other 2 passages, the comprehension ones, would have to amount to 210 plus. So that's 70 marks. Anyway, that's just all straightforward, basic stuff. Let's move on to something a bit more meaty. The grammar questions, okay, a mixture of 1 and 2 mark questions for a total of 10. I've just put up there the examples from the most recent paper for which we have feedback. That's the one that was originally set for summer 2020, but then used in November for a rather limited number of candidates. So they asked you to identify an example of something like the accusative case for 1 mark, tense of a verb, identify the case of insulam and explain why the case is used. That's a typical 2 mark question, saying it's accusative and saying it's after a preposition that takes the accusative. Pick out a pronoun, identify an example of the present tense, a quote, a phrase from the passage, and then says why it's, I mean, what case it's amicis. It doesn't say why there, it just says what it is, just need to say it's dative. The next one, though, a 2 marker again, identify the form of redire and explain why this form is used here. Those ones identify the form, not every time, obviously, but quite often it's an infinitive that they will use for that sort of a question. Find an example of the accusative in a particular line. Explain why parent is subjunctive. Well, it's an indirect command. We'll come back actually to that when I get to the examiner's report a bit later, because there is a slight issue with that, I think. Okay, the English sentences, those use restricted grammar, which is roughly the equivalent in most languages, i.e. present, imperfect, and either perfect in Latin or aorist in Greek. Active, of course, tenses, present infinitive, present and imperfect of to be, cases taken by prepositions that are on the restricted vocabulary, first and second declension nouns and 2-1-2 adjectives, direct statement and direct question. 3 sentences for 10 marks, usually 3-3-4, it could be 2-4-4. The boys hurried into the woods. These are from, again, November 2020. We were able to find the friends. Why were you building the wall, slaves? Pretty straightforward things. Again, we'll come back to a couple of points in those. If both are done, this has been stated absolutely officially, if both are done, grammar questions and sentences, then both will be marked and the higher mark counted. That remains true even if one is crossed through. As long as it's still legible, they will still mark both and they'll give you the higher mark. So that's kind of good news, I think. For the translation section, this marking grid applies, I'm sure people are familiar with. Again, I'll come back to that later on briefly, but one thing to say about it is that it is dangerously easy to fall down from 5 to 3, is my observation about it. In other words, number 4, mark to get 4, 2 inconsequential errors, 1 more serious error. I know those are very hard to define. It's very hard to define them in the abstract. It depends on context, I think. I mean, I think from the mark schemes they do it pretty well, but it is obviously subjective to an extent. But you can fall down to 3 if you're not careful. 1 inconsequential error and 1 more serious is fine. One inconsequential and 1 more serious will take you down to 3. 2 inconsequential would still give you 4. Okay, let's move on. How to get top marks in comprehension? Okay, very quickly through this. For able, well-prepared candidates, section A should be a doddle, really, but it does bring risks of overestimating it. In other words, people think a question can't be answered asking for something as simple as that. There must be a catch to it. No. I mean, it's for the whole ability range, and particularly at the beginning, it will be very easy questions. So don't be afraid to state the obvious. The converse risk, kind of underestimated. Think, oh, this is ridiculously easy. I mean, clever boys are particularly, I think, prone to this, just rushing through, rather despise it, but fail to give full detail and then lose marks. Read the question carefully, do exactly what you're asked. Obviously, that applies to all exams, really. Answer from the lemma provided, not a general recollection of the passage. Derivation questions are straightforward, as long as you understand what is needed. You need to think of an English word that's derived and then from the Latin, and then say what that means. Time in hand can be usefully directed to other parts of the paper. For translation skills, well, this is guidance for teachers as much as for candidates. Start reading continuous passages from the earliest opportunity. Show that secure knowledge pays off in understanding satisfaction. Lead students beyond the skills applied to analysing individual sentences to consider a passage as a whole, the internal consistency of it, anticipation, surprise, how words like conjunctions, particles, any, migi to a tamen guide the thought process. Get students used to spotting words that identify constructions and other important words with more than one meaning. There are lists of those in Latin's GCSE, Essential GCSE Latin, and other places. Give practice in analysing long, complex sentences, isolating main and subordinate clauses, consider likely hazards in particular passages. Discuss how closely the English translation should mirror the Latin. A bit of a tightrope between being too literal, being fairly literal at GCSE, write acceptable English. It doesn't have to be the most natural English. Set texts are usually too difficult to be done from first principles, but where possible, particularly in a prose text, you can often find opportunities to point out constructions in operation. With a verse text, looking at different translations of a passage, asking students which they prefer and why can be a useful bridge between literature and language, even though you wouldn't be able to translate them from first principles necessarily. Very important, I think, this next bit. Familiarise students with story patterns. That's a big theme, so it's worth digressing on it a bit. Give them experience of different authors and genres. As a minimum, kind of patriotic Roman history, the sort of thing you get in Livy, and myth, Ovid particularly, so they know roughly what to expect. Be aware of things students find most difficult: declension and gender, agreement, especially when it's only partial, like relative clauses, number and gender, but not case. Oddities of Latin that we take for granted: lack of a definite article, the fact there is a neuter but it's not used much, the fact that the perfect tense does two different jobs, all that sort of thing. Recognition of unusual and irregular forms, the subjunctive in general, use of participles and indirect statement. Again, I'll come back to that with the examiner's report. This next one is really guidance for students, to tips that can be passed on, and most of it's common sense, but you'd be amazed how much of it is often disregarded. Read the whole passage quickly to get an idea, read it a second time more slowly, translate in your head, identify problems, then work systematically through writer translation. I think it's probably a waste of time to write the whole thing out neatly, though according to the report, people do that. I used to sort of, when I was doing them, sort of write them lightly in pencil and then sort of ink them in, but as long as it's I mean, they understand that you're writing under pressure, as long as it's legible. Be nice to the examiner, but you don't have to write out the whole thing again. The passage makes sense. This is perhaps the most important piece of advice really about unseen. The passage makes sense. So if you write nonsense, it has to be wrong. Use every clue, existing knowledge, the heading and introduction, lost vocabulary, and that doesn't just mean the meaning of the words, but the grammar detail given with them. That is largely ignored by many candidates. Don't leave gaps. Fill them by intelligent inference, not random guesswork. For unknown words, there shouldn't be any if you know the vocabulary. Or unintelligible phrases, put something that could represent the words. They look like nouns, look like verbs, and fits the rest of the story, but don't change bits you do know to fit a theory about the gap. Don't hedge your bets with slashes or brackets. Beware of harmful additions. Again, we'll come back to that. As they really, really stress that in the examiner's report every time, actually. Think what the passage is likely to be saying, but translate what is there and allow for bizarre, especially in myth. Check through, because you've probably missed something out. Okay. This is now more for teachers and sort of thinking a bit more philosophically, approaches to teaching grammar. Clarify your own principles and know how to reply to a student who says they can get a top grade without knowing any grammar. Basically, the answer is they can't. Show students that grammar is essential to Latin and to the rationale for learning it without making it the be-all and end-all. Grammar and vocabulary should feature in every lesson, but not swamp it. Very few people now believe the sort of 1960s, 70s mantra that grammar is acquired by osmosis. The inductive method of introducing constructions can work in the Cambridge Latin courses, but for there's a great sort of tour de force with those cartoons about the ablative absolute, as the sun was rising, when the ships had been unloaded. It's very cleverly done. It's the COC at its best there. But in general, a more didactic approach, I think, is better, especially when time is limited. Grammar points should always be experienced in context. Assume that most students start with minimal knowledge of English grammar and that some will struggle, but don't fight shy of proper explanation and at least some traditional terminology. As you're going along, hammer the three main declensions and the common verb tenses. I mean, there are things, fourth and fifth declension, for instance, that you can afford to sideline to an extent. Constantly consolidate grammar and vocabulary that's already been met. Minimize rote learning by stressing repeated patterns, particularly something like the wide applicability of the set of endings of a 2-1-2 adjective. Stress the basic person endings for most verb tenses, the simple formula for converting most active forms to passive. Emphasize not only the distinction between stem and ending, but the further subdivision. So in festinabant, you're going to show the conjugation, the tense, and the person by different bits of the word. Introduce forms in a logical order and show constructions as part of a logical order. Obviously, you're at the service of whatever textbook you're using there, but as far as possible, that needs to be emphasized, even if the book doesn't always seem to do so. Stress underlying ideas rather than arbitrary sealing rules. Why are purpose clauses and indirect commands the same? Well, answer, because the underlying thought is the same. I sent my brother a letter, but in Montes effugaret. Does it mean so that he would escape into the mountains, or does it mean telling him to? And I mean, you can see that with an example like that, the underlying thought is essentially the same. Make grammar fun. Draw or act out what the nominative or accusative does. You can think of the accusative as a motion towards a target. You can do it like that. You could think of the cases as analogy I've often used as like a row of front gardens in different styles, from the very ordered nominative to the very sort of the ablative that's sort of full of discarded tires and shopping trolleys and things. Okay, leave that to imagination. Okay, successful vocabulary acquisition. Stress manageability. We're talking about a modest total here of 400 odd words. I mean, even Blyton in Noddy Books uses about 700 words in English. We're not talking about any big demand here. Many of them have obvious meaning or derivative. Hammer the point that vocabulary is the best friend in the exam. Stress it has to be a steady process. You can't do it all at the last minute. Think about alternatives to A to Z learning. Group them by parts of speech, by theme, isolate the non-obvious, make personal lists, test by inflected forms, not just the head word. That's really important. It's all very well to know what a verb means in the first person singular, but see the pluperfect passive of it or something, and some candidates are defeated. There are various useful vocabulary self-testers offering tests in various styles. For Latin, Vocab Express, Cambridge CSP, Quizlet. For Greek, there's the Eton College Greek software project, which doesn't yet have, but I think is going to have, chapter by chapter vocabs for Greek to GCSE. This next one is very interesting because this is my colleague Henry Cullen did this, and it's from the book that we wrote called Latin Stories, which are passages for very closely geared to GCSE. So you could take it as you could take it with some confidence that the same would be true if you did it with a set of a dozen GCSE papers. These are the top 100 actual forms of words. I mean, obviously some of them are indeclinable, but particular parts of verbs and nouns that occur in GCSE style passages. So look what's at the top there. Erat, somebody was king of somewhere, whatever. Et, and, where you're going to join things together. Tamen, you're going to make contrasts. Ut, with its various jobs, even at GCSE, at least 3 different jobs, 4 really, isn't it? So you've got result clause, purpose clause, indirect command, and just meaning sort of as. And then est, qui, non, igitur, cum, ubi, ad, quod, itaque. Not how many of those, I'm obviously going to go through the whole list, but notice how many of those, even those very, right at the top there, how many of them are the little words, the connecting words, and it's only, we get to number 16, don't we, before we come to a noun rex, and that's through a mythological passage, somebody was king of somewhere, and all that. So some quite interesting thoughts to be drawn from that one, I think. Points from the autumn 2020 examiner's report. That's the most recent one we've got. They do really hammer this thing about alternatives and harmful additions. Somebody wrote accusative because the preposition, a word's accusative because the preposition ad is followed by the accusative, brackets, it's also the object. But you see the candidate shot themselves in the foot by adding what was obviously intended as that helpful bracket, and so they only get 1 out of 2. Incomplete or insufficiently detailed comprehension answers, I refer to that. He received prizes, is what the candidate writes for multa premia at CATB, so only gets 1 out of 2 for missing out the adjective. In grammar questions, giving an example not from the specified line, identify an example of the present tense in line 3, somebody writes some, which is actually in line 2, so they get 0 for that. In explaining use of the subjunctive in nautas regavit ut navem pararem, that was the one I mentioned before in the grammar questions. Now, slightly to my surprise, the mark scheme and the examiner's report say that they want specific reference to indirect command. Now, obviously, they want to distinguish it, show that the candidate can distinguish from other uses of ut. But I have always in the past taken it as read that if the candidate translated it and made clear that they knew what it meant without necessarily using the terminology for the construction, they would still get the mark. So I have a sort of question mark over that. In the English to Latin sentences, a word has to be completely correct to get a mark. For you were building idificabatis instead of arbatis, would get 0 out of 1. Again, I have a slight hesitation there because certainly in the time I was doing this in Greek, my colleague who was chief examiner in Latin would always operate a sort of unofficial half-mark policy. In other words, there aren't any half marks officially, but if you had in somebody's set of sentences, if they had 2 such examples where you might have wanted to give half a mark, you could give a sort of notional half mark for each one, and so they would only lose 1 overall rather than 2. I'm not probably allowed to say that sort of on the record, but that is certainly what was applied in practice certainly a year or 2 ago. In the unseen translation, translating ibi enim omnes naves proenorum posita erant, and so the ships of the Carthaginians had been positioned there. Okay, that's the point I was making earlier about how dangerously easy it is to slip down to 3 out of 5, because the mistranslation of enim is 1 inconsequential error, and the omission of omnes is 1 more serious error, and therefore that takes you not from 5, not just down to 4, but down to 3. So be careful with those little words, be careful. I mean, it's good advice to say that every single word in the Latin or Greek needs to be translated, or I mean, occasionally perhaps there are things in Greek with men and des, for example, where you might not literally render every word, but you at least need to think about why you're not translating a word if that is the case. Just a couple more points from that examiner's report. There's a need for care, they stress, in rendering genitives and use of apostrophes, eram deorum, the god's anger, or the god apostrophe s anger, one inconsequential error. Well, okay, it's only an inconsequential error, but it could contribute to you losing a whole mark if it were combined with another one. They recommend sticking to of, though, which is slightly sort of defeatist, but I think probably is the best thing to get people to use apostrophes properly in English. General problems with failing to spot or failing to correctly to render superlatives. Some of these are very much what I was saying above on the 8th slide. Superlatives, compound verbs, how Ferro was cited, irregular principal parts, context appropriate sense of words that have several meanings. So Aryan was coming not to earth but to land, ad terram. The use of participles, well, that's a bit of an old chestnut for a problem, but yeah, including the ablative absolute. The indirect statement, again, that's always an area of difficulty for many candidates at GCSE. And the use and sense of active and passive verbs. So no great surprises there. Confusable words, well, there are lists of those in Latin to GCSE and in Essential GCSE Latin. The ones they singled out from the November paper were domus and donum, locus and locutus, and then an old favourite, pugno and opugno. Well, we're going to go through that at a certain amount of speed. If anybody would like to have the notes or the slides or answer keys for any of the books, or has any other questions, do please feel free to contact me on the email given there, and best of luck to you and all your candidates. Thanks very much for listening.